Hello, and welcome to episode 3 of our profile of Mussolini and his fascist government in Italy. We left off last time as the war was starting. Mussolini's policies had taken money away from the Italian army's plans to modernize. Italy was not in a good position financially or militarily to fight a war with the major powers. Mussolini had seized control of all media, dismantled Italy's democratic institutions, and his battle for wheat plan had harmed food production. And in this episode, we're going to discuss how ordinary Italians reacted and how things went under Mussolini's rule. Of course, there were many people in opposition to the fascists from the very start. After all, there were several assassination attempts shortly after he took power. There were also many ordinary Italians who supported the fascists. Fascism has always had an appeal to certain people. It offers seemingly simple solutions to complex problems. It allows people not to have to think about things hard because the strong leader they are following will take care of everything. And if things go wrong, fascists can always blame some other. The Germans would blame Jews and Roma and Slavs for all of Germany's problems. The Italian fascists blame their former allies from the First World War and inferior peoples of causing Italy's problems. Doing all this research, it reminded me of a quote from the late, great Sir Terry Pratchett from his book Jingo. It was so much easier to blame it on them. It was bleakly depressing to think that they were us. If it was them, then nothing was anyone's fault. And if it was us, what did that make me? After all, I'm one of us. I must be. I've certainly never thought of myself as one of them. No one ever thinks of themselves as one of them. We're always one of us. It's them that do the bad things. Fascism is basically lazy thinking. Democracy is hard work. You need an educated and interested electorate for it to function. You need sincere and motivated people to run for office. You need to be vigilant and guard your rights. Fascism and other types of authoritarian regimes allow ordinary people to just check out and ignore everything until they become the other that the regime is targeting. As long as bad things are only happening to someone else, you only have to deal with the terrible economy and the needless wars that fascism inevitably brings. The resistance in Italy was made up of diverse groups who were at odds with each other before the fascists, sometimes while they were fighting the fascists. Communists, socialists, Christian Democrats, labor unionists, all participated in the resistance. In the north of Italy, an old protest song, originally sung by rice field workers, was reworked into a defiant protest against the fascists. The song's called Bella Ciao. There are several YouTube videos for the song with lyrics in Italian and English. I'll try to add a couple of links to the description of the video. One of the reasons there's so many of them is it was apparently recently used in a television show. And yeah, I like the older versions better, I have to admit. And we're going to take a brief sponsor break here. And I will be right back to finish up our little chat about Mussolini. Here's a word from today's sponsor, rentacongressperson.blorb. Today's sponsor is Rent a Congressperson. Are you a billionaire who is fed up with the whole one man, one vote concept? For the low, low price of $1 million, you can own your own U.S. congressperson. Be sure to ask about our special Supreme Court justices. For the price of a luxury RV or a vacation on a private island, you can have your own private justice for the duration of their lifetime appointment. Terms and conditions may apply. We cannot be held responsible if your congressperson suddenly grows a conscience or a spine. Official members of Mussolini's fascist party were never very numerous. The party membership peaked at just over 1 million members in 1927, when the population of Italy was around 40 million people. So that's a really tiny percentage of the population who were actually like card-carrying fascists. Even though Mussolini stated that Italy was overpopulated and needed to expand for more space in his vital space campaign, he also had plans to increase the population to 60 million by 1950. So the party was not wildly popular by any stretch. Here's a few odd things fascists did while they were in power. They decided that, like the French revolutionaries, they needed their own calendar. And where the French had based theirs on the metric system, they even tried going to like a 10-month year and 10-day weeks for a while. The fascists based theirs on the date of the March on Rome by the black shirts, and they counted all of their years in Roman numerals. So the March on Rome had taken place in 1922. So they counted 1925 was year I, year 3, and 1935 was year XIII, or 13. This was a little confusing, but, you know, I don't think it ever really took off amongst the general public. We already discussed how the fascists took control of the press, but as the regime went on, they exerted increasing and arguably silly control over what kind of stories could be printed in newspapers. So they weren't just suppressing like the opposition. They suppressed crime reporting, the reporting of bad weather, shark sightings off popular beaches, or anything that might deter tourism. Bosworth, in his book, Mussolini's Italy, Life Under the Fascist Dictatorship, which I use as a reference for a lot of this, mentions these little gems of fascist logic. And this is a quote. Ferretti complained that any exhibition of nude females would distract young males from concentrating on their sporting lives, and in May of 1930, Mussolini thought it worth his personal intervention to prevent any more gory and racially unsound publicity to be given to monstrous births, which were a popular thing in the newspapers at the time. So, yeah, that's thinking there. Just suppress useful news like the weather and crime. Yeah. And is made famous by Federico Fellini's 1973 film Amarcord. The black shirts really did force political opponents and critics of the regime to drink bottles of castor oil, a laxative, until they lost control of their bowels. It was painful and humiliating, and it was an intimidation tactic that only a really sick person could have come up with. Sometimes I think the whole fascist political movement was just a bunch of schoolyard bullies who never really grew up. It's not the worst thing they could do to you, because they definitely killed people, but it was very unpleasant and very cruel. So, that was just a few weird things that I found out while researching, okay? We're coming to the end of the whole fascist regime in Italy. Italy was unprepared for the war that it had helped to start, and the war did not go well for Italy. When Hitler decided to attack the Soviets, Mussolini offered to send Italian troops to help without being asked. This was deeply unpopular in Italy. Italians saw fighting with Russia as no business of theirs, and the hardships and losses that the troops suffered on the Eastern Front made it a deeply unpopular military post. It would erode Mussolini's support even among ardent fascists. In their conquered lands, Italy's military operations in Africa brought them into direct conflict with British troops in Egypt. When America entered the war after the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, Mussolini declared war on the United States on December 11th. Italy had lost the African campaign completely by 1943, and the Allies invaded Sicily. The Allies were bombing the Italian homeland, including Rome. Food shortages had become extremely severe. The fascists had lost their grip on news and information. In March of 1943, there were massive strikes by labor in the north of Italy, where most of the industry was located. And Mussolini was rapidly losing his grip on the public. When the Allies arrived in Sicily, the locals welcomed them as liberators. The German troops in the north of Italy were seen as occupiers, and the resistance ramped up their efforts, forming armed militias of partisans to fight both the Germans and the local fascists. In July of 1943, Mussolini's own ground council voted him out of office and asked the king to assume his full constitutional powers. The king had a meeting with Mussolini, told him he was fired, and had him arrested on him leaving the building. He was so unpopular at this point that when news of his, quote, resignation, unquote, was announced, people rejoiced in the streets. The new prime minister was Pietro Badoglio. I hope I said that right. I probably didn't. He would dissolve the fascist party and begin negotiations with the Allies. Mussolini was moved from one prison to another to avoid his being rescued by the Germans, which was a fear the new Italian government had. In September of 1943, armistice, tripping over my own tongue, would be declared between Italy and the Allies. The Germans then seized control of the north of Italy and began marching toward Rome. The king and the new prime minister fled, seeking protection from the Allies. The army was left without orders for a little while. The king and Badoglio would form a new government while in hiding and declare war on Germany in October of 1943. The new government agreed to a truce with the partisans in an effort to rid the country of the fascists. The Germans did end up rescuing Mussolini and got him to form a new government in the German-controlled north. So now there are two rival governments, North and South, Fascist and Republican, Axis and Allied. Mussolini's northern government was clearly just a puppet state. The Germans were genuinely in charge. By April of 1945, the Allies were advancing north. Mussolini's puppet government was collapsing. He and his mistress, Clara Petacci, began an attempt to flee to Switzerland. They were caught by communist partisans and arrested. The Southern government and the Allies demanded that he be turned over to them to face war crimes charges. Instead, the partisans would execute Mussolini and his mistress and several members of the puppet government that the Germans had been running in the north. They were shot by firing squad, and then their bodies were loaded onto a truck and sent to Milan and dumped in the Piazzale Loreto that had just recently been named the Piazza Quindici Martiri, or the 15 Martyrs Square, in honor of some partisans who had been executed in the piazza. The bodies would be kicked, spat on, and then hung upside down in the public square. I suspect that this was the fate that Hitler and his friends in his bunker would be thinking about when they decided to take their own lives, not to be shot and then publicly have their corpses desecrated. It was a really grim end. No fascist regime has ever survived the death of its leader. No fascist regime has ever succeeded. They have all failed after wrecking their economies and starting wars they could not win. Franco in Spain had the longest run as a fascist because he didn't die until 1975. But he also he was too busy fighting his own people to invade other countries, and I think that's what kept them from being completely deposed. After Franco's death, Spain would become a constitutional monarchy again. Considering their track record, it's amazing that anyone would still cling to the outdated and evil ideology of fascism. That anyone is still a fascism fanboy amazes me. So this wraps up Mussolini and the rise and fall of fascism. The next couple of episodes, we're going to be slightly lighter in subject matter. We'll be discussing books banned in America and some of the books that I was really surprised to be in like the top 10 most banned books in the States. Be kind to one another. If you enjoyed the video, if you learned something, please like and subscribe. I'll see you all next time, and thank you for watching or listening. Bye.